Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallama ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. So I don't have slides for you today. I'm a little busy, but we're going to begin with this book. This is the Arabic and the English side by side. By now, all of you should have the PDF. The English PDF is, I know it's sideways, it's slanted, it's not the best quality. It's not designed for reading. Someone scanned the pages and 2 pages in one. But nevertheless, you can print it out and read it. So, Bismillah, we're going to begin by reading chapter 1. And chapter 1, we did an introduction and we outlined 5 major chapters in the book in his particular outline. And Al-Bab al-Awwal, and I'll read it in Arabic. Al-Bab al-Awwal, for those who are here, have the Arabic on the screen. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. في بيان العلوم الخمسة التي يدل عليها القرآن العظيم نصا. So I'm going to read in the Arabic and then we'll translate as we go along. And sections that are longer perhaps will be in the interest of time in English. So chapter 1 is entitled Explaining the 5 Sciences that the Quran elucidates through its text. Explaining the 5 sciences that the Quran elucidates through its text. And the translation in this book says the 5 fundamental sciences that the Noble Quran contains. So that's probably more easier to follow translation. So Shah Waliullah rahimahullah says in the opening, لِيَعْلَمْ أن معاني القرآن المنصوصة لا تخرج عن 5 علوم, that the meanings of the Quran are contained within these 5, which he calls sciences. But you can really call them 5 categories or 5 types of Quranic verses. That's another way of looking at it. Number 1, and this is important now, the terminology here is important. So the first category of Quranic verses, ilmul ahkam, the knowledge of the rulings, ahkam, or judgments. So the science of judgments, or the science of rulings. So what is that? He says, وَهِيَ الْوَاجِبُ وَالْمَنْدُوبُ وَالْمُبَاحُ وَالْمَكْرُوهُ وَالْحَرَامُ. He says it's those 5 rulings. What are the 5 rulings? That, in Islamic law or Islamic fiqh, every action is classified, there's a ruling on it. Every single action would fall into one of 5 possibilities when it comes to the rulings. Anyone want to elucidate from the audience, online? What are those 5 types of rulings? Okay, Musa. Haram, good. Haram would be prohibited. Makruh, which would be disliked or something frowned upon. Okay. Mubah, which is permissible, and makruh. Well, you said makruh. Sunnah or sunnah is not the right term. Mandub or sunnah is also used. You're right, but a lot of people confuse sunnah with that, and that kind of obscured the meaning of the real term sunnah, which means the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is recommended, mandub or mustahab. Yeah, and then and then there's wajib or fard, which is obligatory. So every action on the positive side of the scale is either something you have to do absolutely, which would be the strongest ruling in terms of strength, positive strength. So you would have to do it, and that would be called fard al-wajib. Now, give me an example of Quranic verse that would be in that category, wajib, something that's categorically, clearly wajib. Huh? Okay, so aqimu salah, establish the prayer. Allah commands us to establish the prayer. It's a very clear verse, aqimu salah, many verses, 83 verses actually. So when Allah says aqimu salah, establish the prayer, What category of these 5 categories does it fall into? It's the first judgments or rulings. And what is a specific ruling there is obligatory. Every single believer, once you take the shahada, the first obligation upon him or her is the salah. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, this flip side of that would be haram. Somebody give me a verse that elucidates something haram. Online people, you're free to jump into discussion because I don't have slides, so we can have a conversation. Now we're going to be reading this book. It flows much better with a discussion. So what would be example of a verse that shows you something is haram? Preferably in Arabic, but if you don't do it in Arabic, you can give me the English.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Yes, sister.
حرم عليكم الميتة.
Very good. So the word hurrima for haram, Allah says haram upon you. So hurrima, the passive tense, hurrima alaykumul maytata wa dama wa lahmal khinziri wa ma uhilla li ghayrillahi bih. So Allah categorically forbade certain types of foods. So the first one there would be al-mayta, which is carrion, or those animals that die a natural death. And then the other categories, makruh, mandub, they're more complicated. There's more nuance there. They're more subjective. There are disagreements. There's some verses where scholars will disagree. Well, I believe this is recommended versus fard. And then mubah is squarely in the middle of that spectrum. It's an action that has no value, like one way or the other. It's totally neutral, fully neutral. So he says, سواء كانت من قسم العبادات أو من قسم المعاملات. He says this applies irrespective of whether you're talking about an act of worship or ibadat, or you're talking about mu'amalat. Okay, ibadat or mu'amalat. أو من تدبير المنزل, or something, تدبير المنزل has to do with organization of the house. So he talks, what basically domestic affairs would be a translation. أو من السياسة المدنية, or communal politics. وتفصيل هذا العلم منوط بذمة الفقيه. So he makes an important point here. He says, and the details of this knowledge is in the domain of بذمة الفقيه, al-faqih. What is a faqih? Where does the word faqih come from? Fiqh, yeah, law. So the faqih is the person who does law, i.e. the jurist. Okay. So here, now, since we don't have slides, maybe I can start doing the old-fashioned board. Now I do have a wireless, so inshallah, let's see how that goes. So there's a number of things in this first paragraph we learn, which are pretty useful, and I believe, okay. So the 5 categories, the spectrum of human deeds, right? There's wajib, which is the fard or obligatory. There's haram on the opposite side. This would be the positive side of the spectrum. This would be the negative side. And then, so you have wajib, haram. Then category less than wajib would be makruh, or disliked. It's not absolutely haram, but Allah does not like it and He discourages you from doing it. And then the opposite side of that in the spectrum of the positive scale would be mustahab. And square in the middle, neutral, will be mubah. Okay. Now he says, Shah Waliullah says, this applies to all actions, whether there he calls first are ibadat, min qism al ibadat. So I'll just put the singular, ibadah, or and the other is mu'amala, mu'amala. Ibadah and mu'amalat. So this applies to everything, our ibadah or mu'amalat. So basically, our ibadah is all acts of worship, and then the non-worship acts are mu'amalat, which are like basically from what's the root word here? Anybody can tease out the root word in mu'amala? Amal, yeah, deeds. So just an action. So these are basically, a good translation would be transactions, worldly transactions. You can say religious transactions are ibadah, worldly transactions are mu'amala. So acts of worship versus worldly acts. So, and he says this whole discussion is in the domain of what? The faqih. Who understands this science, who has the job of studying this science, is the person of fiqh, one who studies Islamic fiqh. Okay? The faqih. So what is he trying to teach us here? He's trying to teach us, number one, that bringing back to the Quran, all verses of Quran, you pick up any verse, open up the Quran, every single verse falls into one of these 5 sciences or 5 categories. In other words, what Allah wants to reveal to us, a great portion of the Quran is telling us how to behave, telling what's right and wrong, what things are allowed and not allowed or forbidden, and so on and so forth. Now, any questions on that so far? The second science that he elucidates, ilmul jadal. So ilmul jadal. So this falls under, I didn't write down the board, ahkam. So ilmul jadal. What's jadal in Arabic? So this is, jadal is mujadala. There's a suratul mujadala. You know, how does the verse begin? قَدْ سَمِيَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ Barahi, Muslim, a believing female. Allah names a surah after her, Mujadala, the female that disputed. And he says, Allah has heard the one who complained to you about her husband. Okay? So, Jadal, it means to argue or dispute. To argue or dispute. So, what would the science be called? The science of argumentation, or what would be a better word? Ilmul Jadal. Well, let me read what he says about it so you know what we're talking about. Then we can come up with a better translation. وهو المحاجة مع الفرق الأربعة الضالة. It's presenting the proofs to the 4 deviated groups that the Quran addresses. So addressing the arguments against the 4 basic groups that have deviated humanity. What are they? من اليهود والنصارى والمشركين والمنافقين. So he says, what are those 4 groups? The Jews, the Christians, the mushrikeen, the people of shirk, idolaters, and the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. And he says, وَتِبْيَانُ هَذَا الْعِلْمَ نُوتٌ بِذِمَّةِ الْمُتَكَلِّمِ. So this science is the domain of mutakallim. So now the flip side of all of this. So the faqih deals with this type of verse, right? The ilm al-ahkam. The mutakallim deals with ilm al-jadal. What's mutakallim? What's the root word there? Kalam, yeah. So what's kalam literally means speech. But what does it mean in Islamic sciences? When you say ilm al-kalam or the science of kalam? No, kalam is Quran, but in sciences, Islamic sciences, there's a specific term like kalam. We're studying and the scholar who studies kalam is mutakallim. You say that again? Oh, I think it's just unmuted. Yeah.
Is it philosophy? Not philosophy. Yeah, philosophy.
Yeah, so that's one translation, yes. So philosophy, but or logic. So logic falls under that. Philosophy falls under that. But kalam is So what are the groups of kalam that is debated? Well, rational is a type of kalam, but so we're coming to, so kalam basically, when it comes from the word speech, but in medieval Islam, all those debates began to crop up about the nature of God, his attributes, is the Quran created or not? What are the attributes of Allah? Does Allah exist in the world or outside of the world? All those philosophical debates. So philosophy is a good translation. That's one way of looking at it. Kalam is philosophy. But philosophy means something else in the modern era. So kalam is a type of philosophy, but it's another way of looking at theology or aqidah. This whole thing is aqidah in Islam. So aqidah, science of aqidah, is the science of kalam. That's synonymous with kalam. So that would be in English theology. So ilmul kalam would either be translated as theology or philosophy, or the academic books generally use scholastic theology, the scholastic theologians, because that comes from a particular type of way of thinking, and it was very heavily influenced by Hellenistic tradition. When the Muslims discovered all the Greek works, they started translating logic, Greek logic, and Socrates and Plato, and so much of Hellenistic thought found its way within the Muslim tradition, and that gave rise to all of these debates in kalam, and the whole science became known as kalam, dialectical philosophy or scholastic theology, and so on. So let's see what this book translated as. Rational theology. So the mutakallim is a scholar of rational theology according to this translation. Not necessarily right or wrong. So I think rational theology is basically leading the translation into a different direction, because under kalam you have deviant groups that aren't rational, right? So anyway, so theology or philosophy deals with this type of verse, and that is a verse of jadal, giving the arguments to the four deviated groups. So what would be a good translation of ilm al-jadal then? Debate, yeah. But debate, as we covered in the first class of the adab class, like generally debating is frowned upon in Islam. The argumentation and debating is not a positive thing in Islam. So, but yeah, debate is part of it, but that would not probably be the best overall word. Yeah, it's translated that. So ilm al-jadal is, so the translation I'm accustomed to is dialectics. Dialectics is an academic term. Let me see what the book says for it. Science of polemics and refutations. Science of polemics. Polemics maybe is better. Polemics. The science of polemics. So polemics is where you're trying to prove your point against another group. You have two groups on opposing sides and you're proving your point. So this is not necessarily debating. Debating is where you're going back and forth. So this is more like mahaja. Like, yes, debating, it would be part of it in some setting or discussion or debate, but it's presenting the arguments, because da'wah is not debates. So it's a misnomer to think that da'wah is debating with people. Debating with people does nothing for them. Debating with people creates animosity. Debating with people is not the Islamic norm, and that's not what the Prophet ﷺ did. But da'wah is presenting the truth in front of people, calling them to the truth, presenting your arguments in various ways, not necessarily in this formal match between two individuals. So the science of polemics. So what do we learn from here? So Shah Waliullah is looking at, he's a scholar that looks at the bigger picture. He's someone who's always trying to tie everything together. So he's trying to give you all 5 content matters of the Quran. Every single verse of the Quran relates to one of these 5 types of content. Number 1 is ilm al-ahkam, rulings. Praying, haram for you is this, do not commit shirk, so on and so forth. Number 2, the arguments against the 4 deviated groups. So that's another contribution of Shah Waliullah. He says when you look at the entirety of the Quran, all the people that is addressed to, in human civilization, there are 4 major groups that went astray. And all groups, you might say, well, what about this religion or that religion that's not Jewish or Christian? So all of them would fall under these four categories of deviations. And that's really how Shah Waliullah is looking at it. So, and it's kind of a brilliant way of looking at it. What are those? The Jews. The Quran addresses the Jews, Bani Israel. The Quran addresses the Christians, the Nasara. The Quran addresses a lot the Mushrikeen of Quraysh. And the Quran addresses the Munafiqeen, which are the hypocrites, those who pretended to be believers. So for Shah Waliullah, this is a template. The whole Quran is a template. So it's for someone who believes in the Quran as a universal message, you'll see this theme. That's the way they approach the Quran. So everything they're looking at is going to be universal. So these four groups, rather than being specific groups confined in time, there are four templates of human behavior, four ways that human beings go astray. Yes, they are specific groups, but it's not to say that they're not talking about those groups. Yes, when Allah says that Yahud, talking about the Jews, a specific group. But the tendency for us would be, well, that's the Jews, nothing to do with me. That's talking about the Mushrikeen, nothing to do with me. You distance yourself. But if you look at it a different way, that every single verse of the Quran is addressed to me and you, even when the Quran is talking about Bani Israel and Musa and the people asking questions, that's talking to us because we can fall into the same template of behavior. Okay, so that's the second science, Ilmul Jadal. Okay, four major groups, and the Quran addresses arguments directed against those four groups. This whole domain is the domain of Kalam, traditionally. Any questions? Okay, the third science. So the third type of content. So I don't like the translation science so much. It is the accurate translation, but the sense here is more like content. Okay. So ilm al-tadhkir bi-ala-illah. The science or the content of reminding. Tadhkir is reminder, dhikr, right? Tadhkir is the process of reminding others. At-tadhkir bi-ala-illah. Ala-illah is فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. Favors, the bounties of Allah. So reminding people of the favors of Allah. So what does he say about that? وَهُوَ بَيَانُ خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَإِلْهَامِ الْعِبَادِ مَا يَحْتَاجُونَ إِلَيْهِ وَبَيَانُ صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ الْكَامِلَةِ. So he says this is talking about the creation of the heavens and the earth. It's talking about what Allah inspired human beings to innovate for their lives, to all the things that they were inspired to make their life easier, to reflect over the signs of Allah, like shelter and transportation, all those things that are inspired in human beings that they need. وَبَيَانْ صِفَاتِ اللَّهِ الْكَامِلَةِ, and the explanation of Allah's complete attributes and Allah's characteristics. So Tadhkir bi-ayyamillah, the translation, science of reminders, reminding others of the favors of Allah. So think about all the verses that you read in the Quran. Either they're rulings, or they're addressed to Ahlul Ya Ahlul Kitab, or they're addressed to those specific groups, or they're reminding you of the favors of Allah. The bounties and the mercy and the blessings and the power of Allah. How many verses speak about the creation of the heavens and the earth? Inna fi khalqi samawati wal ardi wa ikhtilafi al-layli wan nahari la ayatin li ulil albab. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the alternation of the night and the day are signs for those who reflect. So there's so many verses of that nature. So that's number 3, third type of Quranic content. The fourth type of Quranic content, ilm al-tadhkir bi-ayyamillah, still under reminders, but it's the science of reminding people about the days of Allah, ayyamillah. So that's a specific verse, the specific expression rather, ayyamillah, days of Allah. I want you to pause for a moment and think about what that could mean, possibly mean. Ayyamillah, the days of Allah. Is there a verse that says ayyamillah, the days of Allah? Is a verse that has the days of Allah, specifically that expression, or the day of Allah? Anyone recall? So actually there's a verse, وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ. It's actually more direct than you could think. You were thinking too hard. وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ. Remind them of the days of Allah. So that's this content is taken directly from that verse. Remind them of the days of Allah. So how does he explain it? He says, وَهُوَ بَيَانُ الْوَقَائِعِ التي أحدثها الله سبحانه وتعالى من قبيل تنعيم المطيعين وتعذيب المجرمين. It's the realities or actual realities of what happened, history, that Allah caused to come into effect, whether it's giving good times to the believers or bad times or punishments to the disbelievers, those who disobeyed Allah. So basically, you can say this is history. History. So the days of the past, the days long gone. That's how Allah refers to Ayyamillah, the days of great events, the days where things happen, whether it's the destruction of Fir'aun, or whether the great civilization of such and such that had such wonders, or the destruction of this people or that people, Bani Israel leaving the exodus into the Sinai Peninsula, and then finding the Holy Land, and being banished from the Holy Land, then the destruction of the temple, all those great historical events that Allah speaks about. So you can say the fourth category of Quranic content is history. And Allah has a lot to say about history. Quran is not a history book, but there's a lot of history in it. Quran speaks about past nations, Ad and Thamud, Bani Israel, and things that happened in the past. So surely this is one type of Quranic content. Okay? Any questions? The fifth type of Quranic content, علم التذكير بالموت وما بعده, reminders of death and what lies beyond. من الحشر والنشر والحساب والميزان والجنة والنار. Gives example like the resurrection, the gathering, the day of judgment, the balance of scales, paradise and hellfire. Isn't the Quran filled with that? There's so much reminders of the next life. So you can't say that's history. Where would you put that under? So, so this is actually a very good categorization of Quranic content. Well, I've seen Quranic content being categorized three types: Tawheed, Risala, and Akhirah. Or no, not Tawheed, Risala, Akhirah. That's also one way, but history, law, and theology. That's one way of looking at history, law, and theology. All of Quran is either history, the past, it's law, which is rulings, and theology, what you have to believe. But where does Jannah and paradise fall into that? It's not really history. History is the past, not the future. So this is actually the future. So the Quran, because it speaks about the future, so Shah Waliullah, he creates this category. So these are the 5 types of Quranic content. And then, so 2 of them, one is law, ahkam. Second is jadal, polemics. And the last 3 are reminders. But reminders of, you can say one way of looking at reminders of the past, history, that's number 4. Reminders of the present, that's the favors of Allah, number 3. Reminders of the future, which is death and what lies beyond. That's another way of looking at it. So he says, وَتَفْصِيلُ هَذِهِ الْعُلُومِ الثَّلَاثَةِ وَذِكْرُ الْأَحَادِيثِ وَالْآثَارِ الْمُتَعَلِّقَةِ بها يرجع إلى الواعظ والمذكر. What's the domain? What would be the individual dealing with these 3 categories? Ahkam is for the jurists. The jadal is for the polemicists or the theologians or the mutakallimin, philosophers. And the last 3, reminding others, would be under who? People, who would he call? Like, what could he think of? Common people, yeah, but a little more than that. Okay, students. But like reminding others. Well, who reminds others? Huh? Yes, people of da'wah, people of tazkir, people of reminders. Da'i is one word. So what he says wa'ith. Wa'ith is the one who gives a reminder. Mudhakkir is the one who reminds also. So these are, our masajid are filled with those, right? So people remind others, people give talks, people give reminders after salah. They're not necessarily each one of them is a faqih. A lot of them are just students and common people. But so these are three, this is the first page of this book. And he, hits it on the mark, I believe. It's a brilliant way of looking at things. So already you're being introduced to the way he thinks, the mind of this brilliant scholar. So it's very useful. It's very practical. It's useful for a student. You have this template in your mind, make a chart. Then when you're dealing with the Quran, everything will fall under one of these. Okay. Now, any questions? Then he has two more sections, and then that beginning is done. You need to cover all of those. So he says in the next section, it's entitled Uslub al-Quran al-Kareem fi Ard al-Ulum al-Khamsa. Okay. Okay. So uslub means methodology. So the title of the next section is the methodology of the Quran in presenting. Arud is presenting. Yawma tu'raduna. That's the day your deeds will be presented to you in the Quran. So the Quranic methodology in presenting these 5 types of categories of content. Okay, that would be my translation. The methodology or style. So what does he say? He says, وإنما وقع بيان هذه العلوم على أسلوب العرب الأولين لا على منهاج العلماء المتأخرين. So he makes a profound point. He says the Quranic style in presenting this content is on the style of al-Arab al-Awwalin. What do you think that means? Al-Arab al-Awwalin. Al-Arab al-Awwalin. Yeah, the first audience were Arabs, yeah. But al-Awwalin here doesn't mean the first audience. It means al-Arab al-Awwalin. Awwalin is an adjective. When you have Arabic, and now you're taking Arabic, whenever you have a noun, al something, and another noun, al something, another noun, those are adjectives. It's talking about one thing. So which Arabs specifically? That's what we're trying. The first Arab, ancient Arabs, al-Awwalin. So classical Arabic. So the style of the Quran in presenting its argument, the content will be on the style of the people of the Prophet, which were the early Arabs, that generation. He says, not the ulama al-mutaakhirin, not latter-day scholars. And that's such a profound point, because that's the problem many people fall into. People study Islamic law or fiqh, they're obsessed with fiqh. As an example, and there are others too, other types of people. And when they read the Quran, it's a law book for them. Everything is about fiqh, and it's about, the rulings, and Quran touches on rulings, but it's not written in the style of the jurists or books of law. There are other people that are into history. Everything in the Quran is history. They approach it as a historical book, a book of history, and then they interpret things in that light. You have to understand the Quran is not a history book. It's talking to that early audience. So presenting things in their mannerism, in their style, you have to keep that in mind. Although it does contain history, does contain rulings, does contain theology, but it's not a book of theology. It's not written in the style of an aqidah book. You can't approach it like that. So he said, فَلَمْ يَلْتَزِمْ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى فِي آيَاتِ الْأَحْكَامِ اخْتِصَارًا يَخْتَارُهُ أَهْلُ الْمُتُونِ. So Allah did not confine himself to presenting these arguments or this content in the way people write their books, the mutun. So, you study Aqidah Tahawiyah, you study Fiqh al-Quduri, you study this book or that book. And when you read the Quran, you expect the Quran to speak that language. Why doesn't it use the word mustahab here? Why are you mandating on Allah what should not be mandated on him? This is a different book. This is the source. All those things came much later. So he says, ولا تنقيه القواعد من قيود غير ضرورة كما هو صناعة الأصوليين واختار سبحانه وتعالى في آيات المخاصمة إلزام الخصم بالمشهورات المسلمة وخطابات النافعة لا تنقيها البراهين على طريقة المنطقيين ولم يراع سبحانه وتعالى المناسبة في الانتقال من موضوع إلى موضوع كما يراعيها الأدباء المتأخرين النشر كل ما أهم إلقاؤه على العباد سواء كان مقدما أو مؤخرا. Yeah, so he says, so the Quran is not using the style of the theologians in presenting its argument, so it's not a coherent presentation of a theology. It's not presenting the usuliyin, the scholars of usulul fiqh. It's not using their style of presenting everything in these consistent ways. It's not in the style of the mantiqiyin, the logicians, people who debate and argue. You know, this is this fallacy, this is that fallacy, and this is A to B and C. You have all these specifics that come out. The Quran is not confined to that. Allah is not confined himself to that methodology. And he says, like, and then he speaks about the udaba al-mutaakhirin, people of scholars of literature. So he says scholars of literature. He says scholars of literature, they write a book, and that's, you can say, applies to all of us today. When you write a book, there is a thesis, there's an introductory paragraph, there's some points you're coming across, and then there's conclusions. So that's, you know, the way we write. That's not the way Allah writes. Allah did not reveal the Quran according to that. Then he makes that point last. He says Allah will not change from one subject to another in the style of the udaba, al-mutaakhirun. But he uses what he uses in order to guide people. He uses a more intuitive methodology. So if you keep this in mind, it removes a lot of confusions. So people, when they read the Quran, like now, most will say, well, it doesn't seem coherent. It seems random. It seems like it's jumping from topic to topic. There are people that say that about the Quran. They're not understanding what the Quran is. It's not a written book that's written in a human style, but it's written according to the style of the early Arabs, al-Arab al-Awwalun. So you have to put yourself in their mindset. When you read the Quran, you have to understand what Allah meant. It is universal. So we're not saying it's not universal. That's not the point here. The point here is that Allah is using his own style. And you have to understand that first context. Remember in the beginning, what did I say? You have to understand the Quran on its own terms. Then you have to understand that first context. So you have to understand what the Quran means in the language that it uses. Then you have to reapply it to your context. It's kind of touching on the same thing here. Any questions? Okay. Final section. لا يحتاج كل آية إلى سبب النزول. This is also a very profound section. It's one of my favorite sections. So he says the title of the section, and the titles probably came later, but it is a different subsection or a different topic, subtopic rather. Every verse does not need a cause of revelation. Sabab al-nuzul. Sabab al-nuzul. So there's a science, in Quranic science, called asbab al-nuzul. Sabab is singular, asbab is plural. Sabab means cause or reason. Asbab al-nuzul means the reasons Allah reveals specific verses. So this is like, you know, if there's a verse such and such, the scholar tried to find out, okay, when was this verse revealed for who? Who is this verse speaking about? The specific circumstance for which the verse was revealed. What does Shah Waliullah say? وَقَدْ رَبَطَ عامة المفسرين كل آية من آيات الجدل والأحكام بقصة. He said most mufassirin, people of tafsir, they tied every single verse of ahkam and jadal with a specific story. That's what tafsir is. You open up tafsir, there's story after story. And the implication, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, this is what the verse is speaking about. وَيَظُنُّونَ أَنَّ تِلْكَ الْقِصَّةَ هِيَ سَبَبْ نُزُولِهَا. And many of them think erroneously that that story is the reason why this verse was revealed. Okay? وَالْحَقُّ, but the truth rather is أَنَّ الْقَصْدَ الْأَصْلِ مِن نُزُولِ الْقُرْآنِ the truth of the matter is that the real reason or the aim for the revelation of the Quran, huwa tahdhibun nufusul bashariyah, to refine human souls, refine human beings. That's the real reason of revelation of the verses. Okay. وَدَمْغُ الْعَقَائِدِ الْبَاطِلَةِ. And second reason, to destroy false beliefs. So he lists a series of reasons. Refine human beings. Number two, destroy false beliefs. وَنَفْيُ الْأَعْمَالَ الْفَاسِدَةِ. And to refute or reform bad actions, evils in society. Things like lying and stealing, things that don't make society well. So one of the big reasons for the Quran to be revealed is to reform that. فوجود العقائد الباطلة في خواطر المكلفين سبب لنزول آيات الجدل. So now he's saying the sabab nuzul, the reason for the revelation of the verses, have to do with jadal. What's the reason? So now he's tying it back to the 5 types of verses, 5 types of content. So for him, sabab nuzul for the verses of jadal, what does he say? Is وجود العقائد الباطلة في خواطر المكلفين, is the existence of false ideas and beliefs in the minds of people. That's why Allah revealed these verses of mujadala, of jadal. And then he says, the last 3 types of content, tadhkir. What's the reason for revelation of the past, the tadhkir, reminding of the past, the present, and the future? He says, وَعَدَمُ تَيَقُّظِهِمْ وَتَنَبُّهِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ ذِكْرِ آلَاءِ اللَّهِ وَأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ وَوَقَائِعِ الْمَوْتِ وَمَا بَعْدَهُ. هذا سبب لنزول آيات التذكير. The verses tadhkir, the reason for the revelation is people's ghafla, people's lack of awareness of death, lack of awareness of past history, lack of awareness of the favors of Allah around them. People look at these great mountains and great feats of nature, doesn't bring them closer to Allah. They're totally asleep. Their lack of awareness. So to remind them, to wake them up. So the reason this ghafla, heedlessness, lack of awareness, is the reason Allah revealed these verses, not because of a specific story, the verses of tadhkir. And then he says, ayat al-ahkam, I didn't mention the ahkam. He says the rulings, the verses have to do with human rulings. The reason for their revelation is wujud al-a'mal al-fasida wa shuyu'u al-madhalimi fima baynahum. The existence of so much evil and in society, and bad conduct and evil and injustice and oppression in society. That's why Allah revealed all the verses of ahkam. That's the real reason. Okay, and then he answers about those stories. وَأَمَّا الْأَسْبَابُ الْخَاصَّةِ وَالْقَصَصُ الْجُزْئِيَّةِ التي تجشم المفسرون ببيانها فليس لها مدخل في ذلك. It's very strong language, and you can agree or disagree. I agree entirely. He says, as for those specific stories and specific incidents that are mentioned, that the books of tafsir are filled with, tajasham, he used the word tajasham. The mufassirin, they overloaded their books with these specific stories and incidents. He said they have nothing to do with that. Sabab nuzul. It has nothing to do with that. And he says, يُعْتَدُّ بِهِ إِلَّا فِي بَعْضِ الْآيَاتِ الْكَرِيمَةِ, except for very few sporadic verses. حيث وقعت الإشارة فيها إلى حادثة من الحوادث التي وقعت في عهد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. For instance, if Allah mentions a specific term that's in the Quran that has to do with something that happened at that time or some person at that time, there's a verse, give me a verse with a specific name in it from the time of the Prophet. History, okay, is history. You can say, well, people know about it. Specific name or a place in the Quran. Is there any specific place mentioned in the Quran or a specific name mentioned in the Quran? Abu Lahab. Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. So Abu Lahab, obviously that verse was revealed for Abu Lahab, but Abu Lahab was just an excuse. It was a pretext. That's not the real sabab nuzul. Because if you were to say that's the real reason the verse was revealed, then you have nothing to do with Abu Lahab. It's not relevant to you, the surah. You'll say, well, your mind will say, well, that's not for me. So remember that tension I talked about. There's a tension between the universality of the Quran and the specifics of the context, which is asbab nuzul. If people emphasize the specifics of the context too much, you reduce that universality necessarily. And then that's how many people deal with problematic verses. Oh, that's about mushrikeen. That's about this. That's about that. It's not about this. I have verses that we don't like about the safe, about the sword, and this hadith we don't like. We like to explain them away by saying, well, this is only about the mushrikeen of Quraysh. Nothing to do with you guys. You guys are the good guys. You guys are okay. You can bomb and kill us. You're okay. This is mushrikeen of Quraysh. These verses will never come back. So that's we might not say it like that, but that's the implication. But he's trying to push back against that idea. This is in the 1700s. He's not influenced by modernity, but is a brilliant thinker who's thinking ahead. Because now we realize the problem with that. So he's saying, well, those are illusions. So when Allah talks about Abu Lahab, or وَيَوْمَ حُنَيْنٍ إِذْ أَعْجَبَتْكُمْ كَثْرَتُكُم, the day of Hunain when you were so impressed by your numbers. You have to know what Hunain was. So you have to know that context for sure. But the verse is not really just about Hunain. It's about me and you. There's broader lessons here. So there's many examples, like, well, not many. So there's a handful of examples like that. But just because there's a handful of verses, and he says they're qalil, that have specific allusions that you have to know, you can't make a general judgment that every verse needs sabab nuzul. And that's kind of what the mufassirin tried to do, many of them. Tried to find sabab nuzul for every verse. And they relied on many incidents or stories that were false or weak. Because of that incentive, they needed to find the context. This obsession with context was kind of a style of many of the mufassirin. And then what does he say? ولا يزول ما يعرض للسامع من الترقب والانتظار عند استماع ذلك التعريض إلا ببسط القصة فلازم أن نشرح هذه العلوم بوجه لا نحتاج إلى إيراد القصص الجزئية. So he says it's upon us to explain these 5 Quranic contents, 5 types of Quranic content, in a way بوجه لا نحتاج إلى إيراد القصص الجزئية, that you won't need that context. You don't need those specific stories and incidents. And that's the end of that first section. And then the next section is في علم الجدل. Now he's going to examine those 5 types of Quranic content in detail. Okay, 5 types of Quranic content in detail. So, any questions? We need to finish at 8. We have 9 minutes. So, any ideas, discussions? What do you think? Is that a useful way of looking at things? Do you agree, disagree? So let's open up the floor. Online as well. Just unmute your mics. You don't have to raise your hand. Just unmute and speak. More importantly, you need to understand what he's speaking about. So, at first level of knowledge, you need to understand what the author is saying. Once you understand what he's saying, you're clear on that, then you can bring up, your questions and then try to push back. If you don't understand what he's speaking about, then you can't get to that first step. Any questions? Yes, sir, Bud. You mind grabbing this? The online student don't feel like repeating the question.
I had a question on the first section, the Ana Aslub al-Arab. Is he going to go over what that actually means?
There's a whole chapter on the style of expressions that are used in the Quran. Yeah, that's towards the end of the chapter. Yeah, sure. So he is going to go to the detail. So he's outlining his vision. So the details of every science will be in the chapter. There's a whole chapter about the style of the Quran and presenting content. Anyone online have questions? You have 7 minutes. Should we just go forward then? There's no questions, so we have less to cover later. Okay. Yeah, why don't we do that? Bismillah. So then, Al-Fasl al-Awwal, the first real chapter of the Quran, is this. Okay, Al-Fasl al-Awwal. Okay. So the chapter is called Ilmul Jadal. Ilmul Jadal. Okay. So the science of polemics. Okay. قد وقعت المخاصمة في القرآن العظيم مع القرآن مع الفرق الأربعة الضالة المشركين واليهود والنصارى والمنافقين هذه المخاصمة على طريقتين. So he said the Quran deals with 4 deviant groups, and this argumentation or presenting of arguments to them is done in 2 ways. الأول أن يذكر سبحانه وتعالى العقيدة الباطلة مع تنصيص على شناعتها. He says the first way that Allah deals with this is by presenting their false beliefs and just quoting them directly, just to point out the errors. وَيَذْكُرْ إِسْتِنْكَارُهَا فَحَسْ. And he just mentions he just quotes them, simply quotes them, or he might say how evil is what they say. So what's an example? What would be an example? It's quoting one of their arguments. Anyone can think of an example? Yeah. Yeah. وقالت اليهود ليست النصارى على شيء وقالت النصارى ليست اليهود على شيء. The Jews say the Christians have nothing. The Christians say the Jews have nothing in terms of salvation. Also, وقالوا اتخذ الله ولدا. They say Allah has a son. And what is Allah's answer? Subhana. Subhanallah. Allah is above that. So it's not really dealing with the arguments, but it's quoting the arguments just to show you how stupid it sounds, how silly it is. So that's one way. And thani, the second way of dealing with these groups, أن يبين شبهاتهم الواهية ويذكر حلها بالأدلة البرهانية أو الخطابية. The second way is to deal with them in a more deeper way, to deal with the arguments, explaining the arguments by pointing to the fallacies and the weakness of their doubts and presenting the solutions through proofs, and he says whether they're demonstrative proofs or rhetorical proofs. So you can say briefly or more expanded. Briefly just quoting them to show how silly it is, and sometimes Allah gets into details and pointing out where they went astray and how they're wrong. Those are the 2 ways Allah deals with these 4 deviant groups, his methodology. Then he deals with these 4 deviant groups. This is a brilliant section. So what are those 4 groups? He's going to mention them in detail, and he'll show you how he makes it relevant for us. And each of these groups, he shows you the template in their thinking and how many people contemporarily can fall into that as well. So that's something very, very important. So dhikrul mushrikeen is the first one. So he begins with the mushrikeen, because the mushrikeen are those that Allah speaks about perhaps the most. So he says, وَقَدْ كَانَ الْمُشْرِكُونَ يُسَمُّونَ أَنفُسَهُمْ حُنَفَاءَ وَيَدَّعُونَ التَّدَيُّنَ بِمِلَّةِ سَيِّدِنَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ وإنما يقال الحنيف لمن تدين بالملة الإبراهيمية والتزم شعارها. So he says the mushrikeen were those who called themselves hunafa. So that's the term they use for themselves. And they ascribe to the nation of Ibrahim. So there's something that some people miss or they don't realize, and this is a contribution from Shah Waliullah. So he's trying to say that the mushrikeen of Quraysh, they ascribed themselves to Ibrahim in the Abrahamic way. That's why they had Hajj. That's why they had sacrifice. That's why they had some of these rites. They corrupted them, yes. They had other gods, yes. But still they held on to the Abrahamic way in some way, shape, and form. So the mushrikeen actually are Abrahamic. It was an Abrahamic deviation. So that's an important point, because you have to understand where they went astray. So to understand these groups, where they went astray, you have to understand who they are, where they came from, And that can help you understand where they went astray. So he says, وَشِعَارُهَا in the next section, their symbols, for instance, are حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ الْحَرَامِ وَاسْتِقْبَالُهُ فِي الصَّلَوَاتِ. They were facing the Kaaba in their acts of worship, however deviant they were. They did perform the Hajj. There was a Hajj season before the Prophet ﷺ. وَالْغُسْلُ فِي الْجَنَابَةِ وَالْإِخْتِتَانِ. The circumcision was part of their rites. وَصَائِرُ خِصَالِ الْفِطْرَةِ. وَتَحْرِيمُ الْأَشْهُرُ الْحُرُمِ, the 4 sacred months, forbidden to fight there. They did have that. تَعْظِيمُ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ, holding this place to be sacred, this Masjid al-Haram. وَتَحْرِيمُ الْمُحَرَّمَاتِ النَّسَبِيَّةِ وَالرِّضَاعِيَّةِ. All those evils in society, at a basic level, they did reject. They did accept that murder was wrong and these things were wrong, and so on and so forth. And he says all of these things. So this is important to understand, that these were all Abrahamic in origin, meaning Allah revealed them to his prophet Ibrahim, and that's what the mushrikeen of Quraysh, they were part of that, and they were following that. Allah Ta'ala Alam. That takes us into 8 o'clock. Any questions? I just introduced the next section, and we're going to continue that section next week. Any final questions before we take our break and continue Sahih Bukhari? We're good here? Okay. 15-minute break for Isha.